Good evening, friends. It's time for us to discuss a certain book. A cursed tome filled with dark tales, seemingly designed to haunt children well into adulthood. This book is called In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories, written by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Dirk Zimmer. Two men with the least scary names in all of literature. Published in 1984, this book was part of HarperCollins' I Can Read series. Yes, this book was intended to help teach children how to read. Through the passage of time, many of the tales in the book have thankfully faded into just blurry memories. But the third story, entitled The Green Ribbon, is the one that has continued to torment my subconscious for years. Do you remember The Green Ribbon? It's short enough that I can fortunately read it to you now. And then afterwards, I'll go into the little-known inspiration for this story. If you have successfully suppressed any childhood nightmares that I am now bringing to the surface, I'm not sorry, because now we can suffer together. Once, there was a girl named Jenny. She was like all the other girls, except for one thing. She always wore a green ribbon around her neck. There was a boy named Alfred in her class. Alfred liked Jenny, and Jenny liked Alfred. One day he asked her, "Why do you wear that ribbon all the time?" "I cannot tell you," said Jenny. But Alfred kept asking, "Why do you wear it?" And Jenny would say, "It is not important." Jenny and Alfred grew up and fell in love. One day, they got married. After their wedding, Alfred said, "Now that we are married, you must tell me about the green ribbon." "You still must wait," said Jenny. "I will tell you when the right time comes." Years passed. Alfred and Jenny grew old. One day, Jenny became very sick. The doctor told her she was dying. Jenny called Alfred to her side. "Alfred," she said, "now I can tell you about the green ribbon. Untie it, and you will see why I could not tell you before." Slowly and carefully, Alfred untied the ribbon, and Jenny's head fell off. And Jenny's head fell off. And Jenny's head fell off. Also, Alvin uses the phrase "one day" a lot for such a short story. Anyway, that picture and those words haunted me. And it's not even scary in a threatening way. Like, the story isn't warning you about some sort of curse or some sort of creature that could potentially decapitate you. And Jenny, despite her precarious head situation, ended up living a long, full life. We should all be so lucky. And yet, as a child, I would lie awake for hours with the light on, thinking about how Jenny's head fell off. I would kind of side-eye the shelf in the library where I knew that this book lived. I was obsessed. I was also terrified. What I did not know at the time was that the green ribbon was very likely based on an old French story. This particular tale is included in the book Tales of a Traveler by Washington Irving. This book was a collection of stories and legends that Washington Irving had gathered during his time living in France and Germany. The particular story in question is called The Adventures of the German Student. Washington Irving is also perhaps best known as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, so perhaps headlessness was a favored theme of his. The original tale is a little bit more historical and a little bit less child-friendly. I mean, if you can call The Green Ribbon child-friendly. Although I will say that it has not been confirmed by Dear Alvin Schwartz himself that The Green Ribbon is definitely a modern adaptation of The Adventures of the German Student. However, since Alvin did pretty openly pull his scary stories from urban legends and other common myths and tales, most people do tend to assume that this story is the original source. I'll be reading you some selections from The Adventures of the German Student, as well as walking through the different plot points so you can see how similar and different the two stories are. I wasted the paper to print it out. On a stormy night in the tempestuous times of the French Revolution, a young German was returning to his lodgings at a late hour across the old part of Paris. The lightning gleamed and the loud claps of thunder rattled through the lofty, narrow streets. So, of course, the story begins on a dark and stormy night, and then we are introduced to our main character, the young German student named Gottfried Wolfgang. He is described as a rather gloomy young man, very fixated on his studies, perhaps socially awkward, and he ends up getting into certain materials that sort of heighten his anxieties. The story refers to them as fanciful speculations on spiritual essences. His friends thought that a change of scenery would perhaps help him, so they sent him to France during the time of the French Revolution. I love this description of him. He was, in a manner, a literary ghoul, feeding into the charnel house of decayed literature. Wolfgang, though solitary and recluse, was of an ardent temperament, but for a time it operated merely upon his imagination. He was too shy and ignorant of the world to make any advances to the fair, meaning women, fairer sex. But he was a passionate admirer of female beauty, and in his lonely chamber would often lose himself in reveries on forms and faces which he had seen, and his fancy would deck out images of loveliness far surpassing the reality. It's very floral language for describing what this young man most certainly did in his room while thinking about beautiful women. So then Gottfried Wolfgang begins to be tormented by these dreams, just recurring dreams about the same incredibly beautiful woman. And since his mind is so anxious and predisposed with the supernatural, he becomes fixated on the idea of this fictional woman. And then one night when Gottfried Wolfgang is walking through the streets of Paris, again on the dark and stormy night that the story kind of opened with, he walks through the square where the executions take place, and he actually gets just a little bit too close to the guillotine. But then he sees, sitting across the square on some steps, is a young woman, presumably weeping to herself. She potentially looks like she could be fairly wealthy, but considering it's like the French Revolution, bad things have been happening to wealthy people. So Wolfgang approaches her to speak with her and to see how she's doing and to see if he could offer some assistance, when he realizes that this woman is the woman from his dreams. He spoke something of her being exposed at such an hour of the night and to the fury of such a storm, and offered to conduct her to her friends. She pointed to the guillotine with a gesture of dreadful signification. "I have no friend on earth," said she. "But you have a home," said Wolfgang. "Yes, in the grave." The heart of the student melted at the words. "If a stranger dare make an offer," said he, "without danger of being misunderstood, I would offer my humble dwelling as a shelter, myself as a devoted friend. I am friendless myself in Paris, and a stranger in the land. But if my life could be of service, it is at your disposal, and should be sacrificed before harm or indignity should come to you. He doesn't say "milady," but I feel like it's implied. So his earnestness and his foreign accent actually convince this strange, beautiful, crying woman to follow him back to his apartment. And in the apartment, he gets his first really good look at her. When lights were brought and Wolfgang had a better opportunity of contemplating the stranger, he was more than ever intoxicated by her beauty. Her face was pale, but of a dazzling fairness, set off by a profusion of raven hair that hung clustering about it. Her eyes were large and brilliant, with a singular expression approaching almost to wildness. As far as her black dress permitted her shape to be seen, it was of perfect symmetry. Her whole appearance was highly striking, though she was dressed in the simplest style. The only thing approaching to an ornament which she wore was a broad black band round her neck, clasped by diamonds. So basically now, being in his apartment and being struck by her beauty, Wolfgang confesses that she's been in his dreams, and he avows his passion for her, and she seems to reciprocate his interest. And then he says, "Why should we separate?" said he. "Our hearts are united. In the eye of reason and honor, we are as one." They just met. "What need is there of sordid forms to bind high souls together?" Then he goes on to say that she has no home and family, and he will be that for her, and he pledges himself to her forever. And she clarifies, "Forever?" And then he says again, "Forever." So, pledging yourself forever to a strange woman you just met seems like a bad idea on several levels. And not just because I know this is a scary story. So then basically we have a fade to black, where you can insinuate what has happened between them. And the next morning, Wolfgang goes out to basically look for like a better apartment that is more suited to the two of them. And then when Wolfgang gets back, when he returned, he found the stranger lying with her head hanging over the bed, one arm thrown over it. He spoke to her, but received no reply. He advanced to awaken her from her uneasy posture. On taking her hand, it was cold. There was no pulsation. Her face was pallid and ghastly. In a word, she was a corpse. So he calls the police. "Great heaven," cried he, "how did this woman come here?" "Do you know anything about her?" said Wolfgang eagerly. "Do I?" exclaimed the police officer. "She was guillotined yesterday." He stepped forward, undid the black collar round the neck of the corpse, and the head rolled onto the floor. The phrasing is actually very similar to the phrasing in The Green Ribbon, which also kind of leads me to believe that this is, in fact, the source for that story. But it isn't quite over yet. The student burst into a frenzy. The fiend has gained possession of me," shrieked he. "I am lost forever." Don't pledge yourself forever to weird people you meet in the rain. They tried to soothe him, but in vain. He was possessed with the frightful belief that an evil spirit had reanimated the dead body to ensnare him. He went distracted and died in a madhouse. Maybe it's just me, but I find The Green Ribbon to be fundamentally more terrifying than this story. Perhaps it's because I read it so young that it kind of wove its way into the primal fear centers of my brain. But in the original French story, the mystery is just a little bit more clear, and knowledge tends to remove fear. We know that the girl died at the guillotine, and we know that she was seemingly reanimated for just one night. And, I mean, there is the horrifying concept that the German student potentially did invite in some sort of demon that was reanimating the dead girl's corpse to trick him. But we also get not really an epilogue, but it does conclude the story by basically saying that he went mad and was committed. And presumably nothing like wild happened to him after that, because there's also the framework of the entire book where the stories are being told by one character to another. So there's a little section that I didn't read that's at the very end where the narrator essentially reveals that he heard this story from the German student himself in the mental hospital or in the asylum or whatever they would have called it back then. So if there was more that happened after this, the student would have told it to the narrator. So, you know, it's a little bit of a mystery, but case closed. But in the green ribbon, Jenny has the ribbon her whole life. How? Why? Where did it come from? How does she know what would happen if it was removed? And what happens after Alfred takes the ribbon off? Like, is that what kills her instead of the sickness that she had? Did Alfred also call the police? We don't know, and we don't even really have enough information to guess. And that, to me, just sends my brain just churning through all of these like horrifying dark scenarios, and probably explains why I as a child just could not let this story go. Plus, the illustrations just give me kind of this vague, queasy feeling. Very similar to the Gooey Gus character from Ghost Rider, which was the childhood nightmare fuel thing that I made a Halloween video about last year. Ultimately, the moral of the story is make sure your significant other is 100% not dead before you commit to them.